Welcome to Soul Care with Stevie Boy, episode 46. We're in Philippians chapter 4. And last time we looked at verse 9. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. It's about the example of my life, the example of your life. And then Paul writes, and the God of peace will be with you. He returns to that idea of peace. One quick thing, and it's kind of just one of my, I guess I'd have to call it a pet peeve. I often hear people in public prayers and they ask God, oh God, please be with us, be with them, be with. I think that's kind of not a I don't know how to say it kindly. That's not very smart because God is already with. God, can you be anywhere that God is not? So I think sometimes, and you can pray whatever you want to pray. God knows your heart. I think though sometimes it would be a smart thing for us to actually think about what we're praying instead of just repeating what we've heard others pray. So my sense is, God, remind me that you are with me. You are the God of peace, and you are with me. In these days of quarantine and confusion and so many conflicting reports and information that says one thing and then the next, and when we live in those kinds of times, it's really important to bear in mind, just remember, the God of peace is with us. What did the angel said Jesus' name would be Emmanuel, which means God with us. He's here. And then Paul says, I rejoice greatly. This is in verse 10. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need. Well, I'm going to stop there because what he says next is really, really meaty. He talks about his relationship with the church at Philippi when he says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. This is a very interesting kind of phrasing, especially for anybody who is in a missionary status where you have to raise funds to support your ministry. Paul supported his ministry somewhat through his occupation, his career training as a tent maker, and yet, especially in the time when he wrote the book of Philippians, as he was under house arrest in Rome, doing his bivocational work was not possible. And so he had to depend on the contributions and the donations of others, of the churches that he had planted and that he had worked in, and other Christians supporting him financially. I can tell you from my own personal experience, as my wife and I work with Open Door Libraries, and our income from that work comes completely from the contributions of individuals and a very few churches. I can tell you one of the things about raising funds that I don't yet quite have figured out, and that is how to not be embarrassed. And I don't even know if humiliation is too strong of a word. It's tough for me to ask people to give hard-earned money to me. Here's the thing. I've decided that the scriptures teach, and the example of Paul here teaches, it's not about you giving money to me. This is about you expressing your concern through generosity toward God's work. Oh boy, philosophically I get that, but when it comes down, I'm sitting across the table from an individual who I'm going to ask, can you support us financially on a monthly basis? The words catch in my throat. Paul writes, Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. Knowing, when I look at the list of contributors each month, and we get an email that tells us who has sent in a contribution, it's more than me going, oh, there's X number of dollars coming into the account. That I don't ever want it to be that. I always want it to be a reminder that I'm in the heart and on the mind and in the prayers of these, at this point, only several, but these very significant people who make sacrifices to provide support, income, encouragement because of their concern. In verse 11, I'm not saying this because I am in need, although when you think about it, he was in need, but that's not the reason that he's saying this. For I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Let's unpack that. I have learned. How do you learn anything? Well, one way is repetition, right? I can't learn unless I repeat. The multiplication tables, how did you learn those? You learn them by repeating them. And there's this other aspect of learning that I learn by, in a weird, odd kind of way. I learn through failure. I learn by experience as well as by direct encounter with information, through my visual senses, in other words, reading and listening. I think Paul said, I have learned to be content because this state of contentment is a learned conditional thing. I mean, it's like you don't just wake up one morning and, holy cow, I'm content. How did that happen? Well, you learn to be content. To be content, that's a state of being. And it's a continuing action kind of thing. I have learned, Paul said, to be content. Now, for me, this is very difficult. I tend to not be a real content person. I'm working with a computer that I really like. And you know why I got it? Because I wasn't content with the other computer I had. I've got a nice smartphone, and the reason I got it is because my kids gave it to me. And that's good. I'm content with it, but it's 2 versions old, and golly, the technology is so. I don't know. I've got a 12-year-old car that still runs, and I get more miles to the gallon of gas than oil, so I should be happy. But boy, I would love to have another car. See, contentment doesn't come as a standard feature, especially for people living in the West. As we travel, my wife and I get to travel several times a year for our open door libraries, going to the locations out of the United States. And I realize that many, many cultures tend to be more content than we do in America. Sometimes it's because having more is more expensive. And for instance, in Europe, if you've ever traveled to Europe, if you've stayed in hotels, you realize bathrooms are tiny. If you've been in an apartment, you realize those kitchens are little bitty and the refrigerators are small. Well, part of it has to do with the available real estate, especially if you're in an urban area. The other part is Europeans tend to go day by day. They don't go buy a week's worth of groceries. They certainly don't pop down to Sam's or Costco and get a month's worth of big box items, right? They have no place to put them. So part of the culture is to live day by day. We don't have that in America. Sometimes we live week by week, other times month by month, and frankly, sometimes year by year. we are not a patient people and we are not generally contented. Now, there's a good thing about certain kinds of discontent. I don't think any new innovation would ever happen without somebody saying, there's got to be a better way. And that's a form of discontent. But the other side of this discontentment coin is that if I live my entire life discontent with what I have, it's very difficult to be grateful for what I have. I find that grateful people tend to be less discontent, and the opposite is also a corollary. The discontent are generally ungrateful. Of those categories, I would much prefer to be grateful and content as opposed to ungrateful and discontent. Paul says, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. And then he goes on to describe some of his circumstances in verse 12. I know what it is to be in need. Well, he was in need in a sense there in Rome under house arrest, and I know what it is to have plenty. Well, I really can't point to very many times in Paul's life that he was living high on the hog, and yet in his memory, there were times that he had plenty. Plenty is such a relative term. Plenty for one person is not the same as plenty for another, right? For some families, $100 in your checking account is plenty. For others, $1,000 is the limit. And anything below $1,000 it gets your concern quickly. I understand this. And I know that it's not purely about selfishness. Some of it is just the circumstances of your life, and different people have different circumstances. But here's the thing. He said, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I think generally it's easy to see. He's saying, I know pretty much what it's like to just live. Sometimes there's barely enough. Sometimes there's not enough. And then sometimes there's more than enough. And then he said, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Now think about that. All right, first of all, I have learned, we talked about that, the secret. All right, so pay attention because I want to know that secret. I bet you want to know it too. Because it's the secret of being content in any and every situation. You know what, to me, there's not much secret to being content when you have what you want. The secret is get what you want, and then you'll be content. Here's the other side of that, though. It won't last because you'll use up what you want now later. And when you've used it up, you won't be content. Well, that's just the human condition. But he says, I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. He set this up by saying, when I am in need and when I have plenty, I know the secret of being content in every situation. I'm still working on that. I am not even yet to the point of being content in most situations. The best I can do is I'm content in a good bit of my situation. My dream is to be able to say what Paul said. I am content in any and every situation. And then listen, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And then in verse 13, without saying so, I believe he gives us the secret. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Now, a lot of translations read, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. And this is true. You can do all things through the strength that Christ gives. You can do everything that you're called upon to do through the strength that Christ gives. But the context makes it seems more accurate for this New International Version translation, I can do all this. What? Being content, whether I'm hungry or well fed, whether I'm in need or have plenty. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. The only way that I'll be able to, the only way you'll be able to live and be able to reflect this principle that Paul has given, that we can be content in any and every situation. And the only way we can access the secret of this kind of pervasive contentment is through Christ. I don't want to stretch this so that it no longer means what it means, but I have to say, when I'm discontent, I wonder, am I really discontent in that I wish I had this thing? Yeah, but this thing won't satisfy my discontent. Only more of Christ. And here's a very quirky kind of odd thought. I can't get any more of Jesus. He gave all of Himself to me. But I can embrace Him, His nature, His design, His will, more and more, and pull it more and more into my life. I can choose His will for myself over my will for myself more and more and more. This, I believe, is what gives me strength. I've overshot my time. Well, get over it, because I'm even if I went back and started over, I'd still overshoot it. So that's how it goes. Well, I appreciate, I'm so grateful that you gave me the time, and I hope that we'll get to connect this way again next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.